This is the world according to Jen and Carolyn.
Hey, everybody.
Hey.
All right. So tonight we're going to be talking about hoarding. This episode is entitled, But I May Need That, Dissecting Hoarding Disorder Through a Deeply Personal Lens. So, Carolyn and I firmly believe that hoarding isn't some spectator sport, and that, the people who suffer from this disorder, they're hurting. And the family and friends of these people are usually hurting as well, and are left feeling helpless, alone, and sometimes downright scared for the safety and well-being of their hoarding loved ones. Mm-hmm. How do we know this? Mm-hmm. We've been through it.
Yep.
And so we can speak from both personal and professional experience, because this is something that I dealt with extensively when I worked at the Tenderloin Housing Clinic. Mm-hmm. So we wanted to, shine a bright and empathetic light on a disorder that most people are familiar with because of a show on the Learning Channel.
Yes.
So, we're going to be talking about hoarding. Carolyn, as I mentioned, has personal experience with this. I do as well. We want to set the record straight from a clinical perspective about what compulsive hoarding is and why people hoard. And there are real people behind the messes, real people who are hurting and consumed with dread that fortunately most of us just can't relate to. Mm-hmm. Right? So what is hoarding? Well, with the Mayo Clinic, hoarding disorder is a persistent difficulty discarding or parting with possessions because of a perceived need to save them. A person with hoarding disorder experiences distress at the thought of getting rid of these items. Excessive accumulation of items, regardless of actual value, occurs. Did I miss anything?
No.
Okay.
No.
Want to talk to us about the signs and the symptoms?
It's not, and I think it's important, again, and you can already tell we're being a little more somber about this. And I think it's really intentional that we do that.
Yeah.
Because this is one of those question mark diagnosis, but, same way that people kind of say, oh, I'm so OCD, or, oh, I'm so depressed. And it's like, you have to be really careful. Like, you wouldn't be like, oh, I have cancer.
Right.
Like, we don't throw words around for really good reasons.
Yeah.
And so, when we're really talking about, and also I think it's such a shameful disorder.
It absolutely is.
That, again, when you look at the opposite end of like a show like The Home Edit, which is all about having a beautifully organized home.
Right.
That's social media gold. Mm-hmm. So then the opposite must be true if you don't have that.
Yeah.
And so, really understanding the signs and symptoms of excessive acquiring of items that are not needed, and there is no space for them.
Yep.
So, we all hoarded toilet paper during the pandemic.
Not all of us. That was some weird ass shit, man.
Shit going on. Yeah. But, if you had that experience, I think you can kind of get into the mindset somewhat of, that's a different needing of something in scarcity.
But that's panic. And I think that's what happens when you're a hoarder is you start to panic. I might need that.
Yeah. But these aren't things that they need.
No.
Often.
Nope.
Often. We needed toilet paper.
Right. Yes, this is true.
So, that's not the same that you can even say we hoarded toilet paper. You really didn't.
Yeah.
So you're going to see excessive acquisition of items not necessarily needed, no space, persistent difficulty throwing away or parting with your things, doesn't matter what they cost.
Yeah.
Feeling a need to save these items and being upset, literally distraught into a panic at the idea of them being discarded.
Yeah.
Buildup of clutter to the point where rooms are unusable. Like, this isn't like your weird kitchen drawer.
Right. Everybody has a junk drawer. This is a junk drawer all over the place.
Yeah. That's and again, that's overwhelming.
Yeah.
And a tendency towards indecisiveness, perfectionism, which I think is very interesting. And we'll talk about that later. Why? Avoidance, procrastination, and problems with planning and organizing, they are not lazy.
Mm-hmm.
They are not stupid.
No.
They are sick.
Right.
And they must be treated as someone with any other type of medical disability that we would look at. And
I agree.
I feel very personally and professionally and socially like this is something we have to take really seriously.
Yeah, I agree. So, we always like to kind of delve into history. So we're going to talk about the history of hoarding disorder. So at first, it was called something called Collier's syndrome in honor of Homer and Langley Collier, brothers who, between 1909 and 1947, slowly buried themselves in their family mansion in Harlem, filling it inch by inch. Psychologists decided that hoarding must be a subtype of obsessive compulsive disorder, a repeated ritualized action intended to ward off anxiety. And the DSM used to list hoarding with OCD.
Yes.
It was not its own independent diagnosis, but that was problematic because some hoarders didn't have OCD, but rather suffered from other conditions like depression. So in 2013, that's pretty recent, 10 years ago, hoarding finally became its own condition in the Diagnostic Statistical Manual.
You can always say that so much better than I can.
I just say it real slow. So, Carolyn, we alluded to the fact that we've had personal experience with this. Can you tell me about growing up with a hoarder?
Yes. It was extremely confusing. I think that's the best word as a 41-year-old woman.
Yeah.
I have navigated with it. If you'd asked me at the age of 6, I wouldn't have really understood. We were told that my dad was a collector and to be very proud of this. And I showed off the things he had. I was very confused by the behavior of my parents. I was very confused by what I saw, confused by what I was told by others. Yeah. Again, in retrospect, and I'm sure I'll feel differently later in my life, but I lived in a state of kind of constant confusion over what was reality and what was real, what was unique to my family, and what my body was kind of reacting to, very much reflected in how I was told to respond and sort of ignore things, which to me meant kind of ignoring myself.
Yeah.
Again, I said I was always told my dad was a collector. And again, he was, and our home was really full of a lot of the things. He loved trains, he loved antiques, he loved things.
Yeah.
He'd go to all these shows, he loved, doing that. And for the most part, actually, my home was pretty immaculately clean because of my mom.
Yeah.
My mom is an extremely clean and tidy person. She taught both my sister and I to be extremely clean and tidy. Our home was clean and tidy, but anything that was dad's domain, like I can tell you their dresser, you could see which half was my dad's.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And there was like the line where my mom's like, this is my side, do not let your shit come on this side. We were told my dad was messy because he was busy. He collected a lot of childhood toys, you name it, he saved it. He had piles of things that he would, get to someday. And I'm doing a lot of air quotes today. I grew up hearing things like, well, this will be valuable someday.
Yep.
You girls are going to really appreciate that I have this for you. And again, I love my dad dearly. I love my family, and I'm not trying to mock anything. No. This is kind of how I deal with my trauma.
Process.
But over the years, when I think back and I look at my childhood, it was really clear that we were all suffering from his disease.
Right.
And only now as an adult am I understanding that the way we kept this secret was so much part of the shame of how we coped.
Yeah.
Even my therapist didn't know that this was going on.
It's embarrassing.
Yes. And I hated having friends come over.
Yeah.
But I always really wanted them to. But when they would, I'd feel really embarrassed, really ashamed. As my dad got older, his hoarding got a lot worse.
Yes.
And he refused to throw things away. His stuff was managed brilliantly by my poor mom and all of us when we try and clean things up.
Yep.
But he kept things in storage or far out of sight, unbeknownst to us even. And, this was constant tension that was always in the home. And it still honestly exists today, and it impacts our family, but it's also how we survived.
Yeah.
And, I think it's really insightful to share that as a little girl, when I would go to my friend's house, I would clean up their rooms.
Yeah.
Anywhere I went, I'd clean up their house.
You weren't able to do it in your home because you couldn't touch dad's stuff.
And I think that's so, talk about a little kid, cleaning up other people's shit.
You internalized it. And you're
what the fuck?
Yeah.
So again, this is a really activating topic to this day. I don't honestly know how this is going to hit my family. I've talked to some of them about wanting to do this episode, but the pain, it's pain and confusion, and it is absolutely palpable.
Yeah. And I feel similarly. My husband is our producer, and I wanted to talk briefly about my mother-in-law, and I want to be incredibly sensitive in discussing my mother-in-law, whom I love dearly. I think it's important to discuss not only her condition, which got so bad that she was unable to use her stove and her bed, but also friends and family, their unwillingness to confront the issue head on. They didn't really know what they were looking at, right? And I'm not blaming.
No.
There was a limited understanding of what was going on. It was, well, she grew up during, she had depression era parents, and I'm like, no, that's actually statistically not how it necessarily works. Say about my dad too.
Well, he grew up in the Depression, so yeah. So
it's a lot of just brushing it under the rug, and so I'm not blaming anyone. And at the same time, I think that people are, as I said, one, reluctant to call someone mentally ill because there's a stigma associated with this, and two, it's easier to refer to somebody as goofy or an odd duck, fill in the old-timey term, which I think is actually really cruel and pejorative and doesn't address the issue, and it doesn't deal with the issue. But when someone's house is filled to the fucking brim with stuff, when that person is washing the skin off their hands and is typically 3 to 4 hours late to family events and has always been, you have to start asking the hard questions, and you have to start doing the work, and you have to start facing some truths that are incredibly uncomfortable. And so, my mother,
like truths.
No, most people don't. And I hated being the one that came in and kind of shined the light on it. I was an outsider, one, and two, I had absolutely no problem saying that the environment that I grew up in as a child was my mother was mentally ill. And so, and I, by virtue of the work that I've been doing for most of my adult life, working in nonprofits, I have worked with folks who have diagnoses. And so for me, it's not stigmatizing. It's empowering to know what it is that you're dealing with and how to treat that. And it's a really hard pill for a lot of people to swallow. And I get that. And again, there's no blame. So, my mother-in-law is now safe and sound in a beautiful assisted living facility where, my husband and I were like, we need to do something. And we put her in this amazing facility where all her needs are met. But prior to that, I got her a therapist who specializes in hoarding and collecting. And that went terribly wrong. This person was overwhelmed. This person admitted they made, bad decisions and focusing on helping her dispose of her mail instead of focusing on what's going on in her head, in her body, in her mind.
Yeah, it's not a lack of organization.
No, absolutely not. And yes, the mail was a problem, but it's like putting a Band-Aid over a bullet wound. So it's really hard to find treatment for these folks. And so many of these therapists who focus on hoarding, they're like, okay, you got to come to this meeting. And it's like, well, my mother-in-law is dual diagnosed and has OCD and, issues with executive functioning and can't get anywhere on time. So I'm really going to need somebody to come to her. Yeah, and that was really hard to come by. Yeah. So,
well, not a lot of clinicians will do this work.
That's right.
Because I can't handle it. It's very triggering.
It is very triggering. Yeah. For somebody like you who lives with it. So, it's tough. Like the whole system is just not built up properly. And we'll talk a little bit more about this for helping people. And God forbid you're low income and you don't have good insurance or insurance at all. You really don't have access to this stuff. So, there's so many well-meaning people, I think, in the lives of people who hoard, who want to focus on the mess. And they're like, if we only clean up the mess, that's the magic bullet. And I don't think they realize how activating that is for somebody who is a hoarder.
Well, even the show, that's the whole tenet of the show is they end on like, look at this clean living room now. Yes. And they always go, the person didn't stick with anything and they got evicted because it all comes back.
Because they didn't address the problem, the root of the problem. And so I wanted to talk about that. So, I blame a lot of this on the show Hoarders. And this is from a great article. So it says, in the final scene, all of Laura's stuff is gone and the whole family is gathered comfortably in the living room. According to the logic of the show, the clean house, not the family's resilience, is their redemption. Instead of dividing Laura's life into horrific before and a peaceful after, I wish A&E had shown its mundane fullness and complicated joys alongside the pain and the trash. If less time had been spent discussing the odor of the basement, Perhaps more time could have been spent acknowledging the heavy lift of loving the most broken parts of one another. Oh, that's so well written. And I'm so sorry I said TLC earlier. Sorry, I don't mean to indict you, TLC. I guess it's A&E that has this show. I don't watch it. But, hoarding is about more than the stuff. Mm-hmm. The stuff is incidental. Yeah. It's about what the stuff represents and parting with the stuff. And it's truly traumatic for those suffering from hoarding disorder. So, Carolyn, can we talk about why people hoard and collect?
Mm-hmm. Well, you did a good job explaining that. Again, like with many mental health disorders, if we only look at the behavior or the outcome, that's a downstream approach.
Yeah.
And, we're missing what we call root cause. And just like disordered eating isn't really about food and body dysmorphia isn't really about vanity, it helps to conceptualize hoarding outside of the stuff and look at the broader issues co-occurring. And there's growing scientific chatter on this disorder. In and of itself, it's, again, you'll hear a relation to OCD, which stands for obsessive compulsive disorder. There's also a subset of personality disorders called obsessive compulsive personality disorder, OCD-PD. I've even heard, and I'm really happy I can hopefully help dispel this, even autism, people have tried to say it's linked to this, but we, like you said, we all have that one drawer in our home, unless you're a minimalist.
Right.
So I think we can all kind of relate to this, like, well, I don't really need it, so I'll throw it here, right?
I can't bear with throwing it away.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to put it in this drawer.
Yeah. And so from a mental health perspective, you have to meet you have to meet a specific number of criteria in the Diagnostic Statistics Manual, number 5, which is where they're on now. There has to be a persistent difficulty discarding or parting with possessions, regardless of their value. Paper products, magazines, think about mail. Mail's really hard too, because mail's insidious. It's going to keep coming unless you tell
And the older you get, my husband wanted to start a website called Shit My Elderly Mom Gets in the Mail. It's like, look at this $2 bill and here's some stamps.
Oh my God. Well, now I'm the recipient of some of that mail.
Yes, you are. We'll get into that later.
Plastic bags, boxes, clothing, animals, and bodily functions and food. These are often the things they have difficulty parting with. So that's one of the criteria. The second is difficulty in discarding possession due to this distress associated with getting rid of it. So, if you kind of always have a couple plastic bags just in case. Once it gets to like 5, I'm like, okay, I don't need anymore. I can recycle them. This person would kind of have a very, these items could be useful. They might find them aesthetically beautiful. I might not, but they might. Sentimental attachment, though, regardless of the perception of others, is a big one.
Yeah.
I have to keep this, these ties, they were my dad's ties, things like that. There's often, this is huge, guilt over being wasteful with an item. It could have value, or also valuable information. I think especially with elderly population, that is true.
You saw that when we were cleaning out my mother-in-law's house. It was like, I'm going to keep this recipe and, writing notes.
Or it was in my mother's handwriting. Right, that's all I had, but I'm not just going to keep one. I'm going to keep all of them.
Yeah.
So, that I might need this later. Another one is it's intentional, not passive. So that's really important to understand. The difficulty in discarding possessions leads to clutter of living spaces, and it compromises living space. So even if you have that one drawer, it's one drawer. It's not compromising anything. If you really sat down and cleaned it, the average person probably could. Yeah. But we're talking about like rooms,
blocking a stairway,
like
fire
basement.
hazards.
You could barely walk through our basement at one point. Any room my dad would kind of get as his, within months, not even, it would be unusable. Yeah. Until my mom would get in there and ultimately get pissed off and throw shit away, and then that would be a whole thing.
Oh yeah.
So, we're talking your activities of daily life, mobility is not safe, can't be used. It impacts the community, not just the individual. If you're living in an apartment, I'm sure you notice this with the Tenderloin housing, you're actually posing a fire risk to other tenants.
Oh yeah.
And that's usually where you get government coming in and, you know,
we had bed bugs.
That's what you love is when someone has a mental health disorder, now you have cops coming in or prosecution coming in.
Yeah, that never works out well. But we had people who were hoarders and collectors, and they would bring things off the street that were infested with bed bugs.
Yeah. And this is another one. It creates clinically significant distress or impairment in functioning, including the ability to maintain a safe space.
Yeah.
Someone who's a hoarder often has what we call poor insight. And they can't really, you know, if the doctor asks them or if someone asks them, they're going to say, oh no, I'm living at home. I'm fine.
We went through that. Yeah.
And again, there's no brain pathology. There's no reason why this is happening. Although I do think when you're talking about obsessive compulsive disorder and other co-occurring disorders, that is a pathology that is going to limit your cognitive function too.
Yeah.
So, they're also very interesting. There's something called specifiers. So, it's something like 80 to 90% of hoarding disorders actually meet this criteria of what we call excessive acquisition. And think of that like with mail, M-A-I-L, not Mel. Think about it with men. I'm hoarding men. It's raining men. Yes. See, we got funny.
That's not a
problem. So you can have with insight, good or fair. They might see it's a problem. Poor insight, they might see it's a problem, but it's not really that big of a deal. Or absent, delusional, they don't think it's problematic at all.
Okay.
So their level of insight is very important.
Right.
This I think is very fascinating. Usually you're going to see the onset in adolescence, and it always progressively worsens as the person gets older over the lifetime, which is with its peak at about 40 to 50, you have 3 times more risk. People who tend to live alone, that makes sense, especially later in life. If you think of how we age in the society, we're more isolated. Gender-wise, there is some evidence that this is more prevalent in men than women.
Interesting.
But it's more likely that you're going to see it clinically in women because women often seek treatment.
More socially acceptable for us to seek treatment.
And it's estimated that 2 to 6% of the American population has this disorder.
Okay.
So I know you might still be thinking though, but why? So here's what it is and what it isn't. It's not laziness, not lack of motivation. Again, it's not stupidity. And especially it's not that they don't care. That's really hard to tell family members, right?
Yeah.
The answer to why this starts with comorbidity is that, you know, which basically means 2 mental disorders.
Yes.
Appearing together is substantial. 75% of hoarders will have anxiety or depression. 20% will have obsessive compulsive disorder. Those with hoarding often seek treatment for this, but the hoarding is private. So it's not uncommon that I will see a lot of this in kids or in young adults where they're talking about anxiety, depression. It usually comes up that there was hoarding or some type of anxiety or depression or OCD behavior in their home. And so, you know, again, it's a very private thing. This changed during the pandemic. A lot of our environments also became very known. I discovered a couple things on video with telehealth with clients where I was like, ooh, that's interesting that's behind you.
Why is there a mountain of newspapers
Show
behind
me
you?
that. Yeah. So, you know, so when a client is showing comorbidity, I think it's important to always think about their environment.
Right. That's
hoarding an issue. So without exception, hoarding is accompanied by anxiety, depression. Neuroimaging studies are really helpful so that we can look at, commonalities amongst hoarders with emotional, especially with the emotional attachment to these inanimate objects and extreme anxiety when making decisions. Or with my dad, it was extreme anger. He'd get really into cleaning and then he'd hit kind of a weird limit where he'd be like, yeah, throw it away. And then like, I remember once we were like, I was going to throw away like an old plastic tube and he flew off and he was like, I'm done with this. Why, you know, I need that. You don't know when I need that. Or like just things where it like didn't make any sense. And we were like,
made sense to him.
I thought we were being helpful. We are clearly not helping. We're going to stop now. So what happens is that hoarding kind of relieves anxiety, but it also generates it. And the more the hoarder accumulates, the more insulated they feel from the world and its danger. So it's like you're building a cocoon.
That makes sense.
Comforting. But of course, the more they accumulate, the more isolated they become from the outside world. And then family don't want to come around. Friends don't want to come around. Even the thought of discarding or cleaning out hoarded items makes extreme panic and discomfort. And I think people think that's an over exaggeration. It's not.
Yeah.
Hoarding is viewed as, we talked about the OCD, the obsessive compulsive disorder, which is, again, very closely linked to anxiety.
Yes.
And, it's that compulsive acquisition, and you have a pleasurable feeling, though, with OCD. There's a pleasurable feeling. I'm sorry. Excuse me.
With hoarding.
You get a pleasurable feeling.
Because it's
OCD, you don't enjoy the OCD.
Well, it's a product of anxiety, as you said.
Yeah.
It's like, I have to wash my hands 150 times a day because there are germs.
Yeah.
And you truly feel like these germs could potentially end your life.
So it's not enjoyable. And, so you'll hear a lot too. I'll talk about the ADHD and the autism commonly associated with hoarding, but there's very little research suggesting that people with ADHD or autism spectrum, there's a correlation. I ran into that, though, a lot in the articles that I read that were more pop culture articles. But then when you actually look at the research, it doesn't track.
Okay.
So I do want to...
I hadn't really heard that either. Yeah.
Yeah. So, again, you're probably still wondering, but why do they do this, Carolyn? Why? Like, all the stuff, all the reasons, all the clinical stuff. All right. So we don't really have an identification.
Yeah.
And although we know some of the risk factors, all right, and this I do 100% believe in, because, again, like any clinical thing that we see in humans, any type of anxiety, there's usually a traumatic event experience.
Oh, yeah.
And the difficulty making decisions or having a family member who hoards make you at higher risk of developing that disorder. So we see that intergenerational trauma happening. And the majority of people with hoarding disorder, also, there's a comorbidity. They suffer from other things that more likely will get treated, and often the hoarding doesn't.
Yep.
So the hippocampus is in your brain. That is the part of our brain where trauma, and there's the connection. Anytime you read about trauma, you're going to read about the hippocampus. Yeah. So a 2012 research article from the National Institute on Health Reports showed that certain brain regions are underactive in people with hoarding disorder when dealing with other people's possessions, but overactive when deciding whether or not to keep their own things.
Oh, wow.
So these findings suggest that there's a biology of hoarding that may guide future treatment and strategies. So, basically what they're seeing is that your ability when it comes to your stuff, there's these regions of the brain that deal with decision making, attachment, reward, processing, impulse control, emotional regulation. They, through MRIs, that's where you're going to see that neurological basis of hoarding disorder.
Okay, interesting.
And they compared those brains to people with hoarding disorder and people with OCD or healthy controls when it came to discarding possessions. And what do you think happened? The people with OCD and the people with hoarding, the anterior cingulate cortex and the insula, which we've talked about before with addiction, that's part of your limbic system, the deep region in the brain, that is what gets compromised.
Okay.
And so remember how I said trauma is a precursor to hoarding?
Yeah.
Well, the connection to trauma is that the hippocampus can get affected physically. It can shrink. It's not working optimally in people with trauma. It's smaller. It doesn't mean it can't regenerate. Your brain is really powerful.
Yeah, it is.
But that is how significant trauma affects the brain. And the hippocampus will affect the ability to recall these memories in trauma survivors.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And you absolutely can retrain your brain, but you have to first be aware that there's something going on that requires you to do this retraining, And if you've normalized this, if this is the only way you've ever existed, if nobody has tried to help you see that this is problematic, and this is having a negative, a deleterious impact on your life, what are you going to do?
Well, and how do you explain if if a hoarder's ability to make decisions about their possession is hampered by abnormal activity in their brain regions?
Yeah.
That's intensely significant.
Right.
So you can't reason.
No, they're literally wired differently.
Yes.
Their brains are wired differently.
And that's what these research studies found, that quote, the ability to make relative judgments is so overwhelming. Yeah. And it's averse to someone. And so that is seen as you're being difficult, you're being this, and then people act cruel to you.
Yes.
And, so our brain chemistry and function contribute to the hoarding, but the regions of the brain, are very important when we're talking about how trauma impacts that.
Yes, that makes a lot of sense.
Imbalances in the neurotransmitters, dopamine, serotonin, that also can contribute.
Yeah.
So that's where often SSRIs are prescribing a medication in conjunction with talk therapy. The one everyone loves is cognitive behavior therapy.
Which we tried with my mother-in-law.
I don't think standalone that works.
Exactly.
Well.
Standalone, not effective. As part of an overall treatment plan, which typically includes medication.
And also, but maybe.
Yeah.
I don't know. My school was predicated on teaching us 3 semesters worth of CBT. It was very CBT based.
Yeah.
I've very rarely been able to use CBT with someone until they have come to the stage of acceptance.
Interesting. Yeah, well, no, that makes total sense. Because they have to be willing to do the steps.
Well, and if I'm going to tell you something's absurd, but in your brain is telling you, no, it's not. Now I'm
You're the enemy.
Why would you trust me?
Yep, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So I want to move on to this point of, doctors really needing to make this connection, not just to identifying hoarding and any other comorbidity, but mental health stuff alone. Because, should your primary care physician be diagnosing hoarding disorder? No, but most people go to their primary care physicians first. And so doctors need to have some sort of training where they are able to at least identify, address, and refer. I was absolutely frustrated. My mother-in-law had this leg issue, which ended up being related to not walking enough. And she wasn't treated properly. And my husband was the person that was taking her to the doctor. And I said, can you please have a conversation with the doctor about getting a neuropsychological evaluation? And he goes, that is a really good idea. He goes, I always thought that there's something else going on. It's like, motherfucker, you've been her primary care physician for how many years? And you're like, yeah, that is a good idea. Why did you as the doctor never suggest that? Mm-hmm. Completely and totally infuriating. There's that disconnect that we always talk about between doctors that treat the body and think that not the brain necessarily, but the psychological and emotional pieces of the brain are like a separate fucking entity.
Interdisciplinary. I mean, wouldn't it be great if you could see a doctor, a social worker, a nutritionist, a therapist at your visit?
Yeah. And I mean, doctors can't know everything, but at least a baseline understanding. Yeah. And this is a really interesting Huffington Post article. It's a study recently published in a journal called Health Affairs. And the study looks at treatment and management of depression. So doctors neglect to follow up with their patients who have a depression diagnosis. They also are less likely to help depression patients manage their illnesses. Meanwhile, these doctors are more likely to engage in care strategies with patients who have chronic physical illnesses like diabetes. Reasons cited, insurance issues are part of the reason why the study found a lack of depression care management from primary doctors in the first place, according to NPR. Time constraints were another reason. And actually, depression is the leading cause of disability worldwide. So there again is that fucking brain-body connection. Weird, right? So it's a huge problem because, as I mentioned, primary care physicians, they're usually the first line of defense for people. We know how to identify changes or challenges with our mental health and can probably diagnose ourselves. But what about people who can't? Like me and you know what's going on. But my mother-in-law, for instance, and your father, who had, it seemed like a pretty deep-seated hatred of psychology and psychiatry. Like, fuck this shit, you know? Yeah. But because your dad was a doctor, he was a physician. If another physician was able to have a conversation with him on that level, hey, I'm an MD, you're an MD.
Oh, he would have denied it.
He was also a narcissist.
Yes.
So there's that shit. Comorbidity.
I would have loved to be there for that.
Oh, God. Fly on the wall, right? So, this should really be a wake-up call for doctors. Individuals with mental health problems are more likely to die from cardiovascular disease, cancer, stroke, and respiratory issues. And a growing body of research suggests that stigma, discrimination, and diagnostic overshadowing are all big drivers of this health disparity. I know when I finally took control of my mother-in-law's health, of her medical stuff, And, I felt like a puppet master. My husband was on board at this point, but I was like, you need to talk to, she got connected to a neurologist. And the neurologist was reluctant to prescribe Lexapro. And my husband, I was so proud of him. He goes, they kept saying, what are your goals? What are your goals? He's like, well, I don't want my mom to wash the skin off her hands. I don't want her to obsessively collect.
That is so odd.
Right? All these things that, and what's hard is that my poor mother-in-law has recently she's the sweetest person in the world. She's also been diagnosed with dementia. And so they're now, because she's in her 70s, attributing all of these behaviors to dementia. And I kept saying to my husband, and I'm the one that writes the emails pretending to be my husband to the doctors, these things existed long before she had a dementia diagnosis. So I know that that's pertinent. And we have to talk about that and how other medications for the OCD and the hoarding might have a negative impact on that. But it's a part of who she is and who she's been for a very long time. But there was so much resistance. And it was really frustrating. Can you talk a little bit? I'm switching gears now. You talked a bit about this. Can you talk about the impact on the family when somebody has a hoarding diagnosis?
Well, again, that's all the shame. And it's not just unique to hoarding. Clutter is one of the biggest contributors of relational tension, but I think we can both attest to the fact that this is extremely frustrating.
Yes.
And it's hurtful for the family, and it's a risk factor for children, which is why it is included for mandated reporters to alert CPS.
Yeah.
And in 2007 New England Hoarding Consortium newsletter highlights what I think we can both agree on from personal experience. So the loss of or elimination of functional living space. This is the inability of not just you, but your family to use furniture, appliances, countertops in their intended manner. You basically can't enjoy your home.
Right.
And that was true. Especially my mom, like I said, really kept things in order and kept things clean, but there got to a point where she just got worn down.
Of course. And because it never stops.
It never stops. And, so this is decreasing and eliminating functional space, meaning families aren't able to use their kitchens to cook.
Yes.
And therefore they can be dependent on ordering out. This can have a huge financial strain. We see a lot of malnutrition and weight loss or weight gain in families where this is occurring. And so again, acquiring additional storage, chests, lockers, garages. I remember we were constantly getting sheds. And it's like, okay, well, once we have that, I'll put all my stuff in there. But then that would just be another space to put things. And it was something like, over 10 rooms of storage across 30 years. It was very, very insidious.
Yeah.
And so ironically, what usually happens is, it's just, everything just keeps going and going. There's that domino effect. So the health and the wellness of the family, not just of the hoarder, but they experience, you can have headaches, respiratory problems, asthma, allergies. I had all those things.
My
as a
mother-in-law's allergies were out of control.
Yeah.
And you saw, folks, side note, we mentioned this in previous episodes, Carolyn now lives in my husband's family home and was kind enough to help us. I mean, it was mostly me and my husband cleaning out multiple generations of stuff, but, it was the stuff that we found. It was like bags and bags and bags of unboxed QVC jewelry. It was very sad. And I feel so much for my husband.
Oh, yeah.
Because you and me, we're going on, we're just, this is a task. We have to get this done. This stuff is garbage. Let's throw it away. And my poor husband, and that was the impact that I saw for him. Yeah. Was having to throw these things away, which he knew needed to be thrown away or donated.
But the emotional part.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, and we experienced this. My father had passed away, and watching my mom, all three of us kind of having a really different reaction to this.
Yeah.
And, my mom was just, get the fuck rid of all this shit.
Yeah.
And there was sort of this, like, my sister and I being like, well, we kind of want to keep some of this, but then we'd want some of who's covered in mold or things like that. So
I think it's particularly hard for the partner.
Oh, 100%. My mom is a saint. For dealing with that. She often is like, I'm sorry. And she's often apologized. Aww. It's like, you could not win with my dad. It was impossible. No. So again, it's very, very dangerous, not just physically and emotionally, but for health, mainly health reasons.
Yeah.
It significantly impacts your environment. High levels of dust, mildew, fungus.
Yeah.
You can't, like we've talked about, you're not going to be able to safely navigate through your homes. You're not going to be able to do things. Yeah. The safety alone, the integrity of the home, the danger, having pets. Like I have a hard time dealing with animal hoarding.
Yeah.
And those types of things.
That's a
very different
variation of this.
Yeah. But it's just not okay. Like any facet of reality, but I think the emotional pain that this has caused my family long after my father's death still causes, kind of, we'll start laughing about it, but there's sort of pain and anger under a lot of that stuff.
Yeah.
And, so I mentioned family members feeling really frustrated, overwhelmed, resentful. Certainly the health and safety concerns have tremendous effects, but this embarrassment, this frustration, this resentfulness, this hopelessness, this is huge.
Yeah.
And, that's why I think people don't talk about this. And that's why I think people are reluctant to even ask, because even therapists, sometimes we don't want to make you uncomfortable.
Sure.
It's like, I'm supposed to ask you the things that are hard, but I also know you might lie or you might say something. Mm-hmm. So, the shame and the lack of control. Your home's not your home, as I talked about. Children are embarrassed. This is really awful on the children. The stress on the spouse often causes divorce, separation. And again, just torn systems. Usually on the show Hoarders, what they'll often have, there's always like one person, it's usually the daughter, who will one family member will still be trying. They're usually the codependent one. Like, come on, we can make this work. And then there's like the one who hates the parent and doesn't talk to them.
They're just done.
They're just done. And again, you're like going, well, God, this person needs compassion. And again, I bet I've been that person who's like, fuck this shit, to throw it all away, burn it all. But that doesn't do well when you're talking to the person.
No, but I understand being fed up to the point where your empathy is just gone.
Yeah. And so usually it's an outsider like you. It's a neighbor, or it's a teacher or a clinician or a family friend, someone who becomes aware of the situation. Typically calls CPS if there's a child involved, which thank fucking God, and please do. It's anonymous. They're not going to say like, hey, Carolyn called on you out, son. But also, you can call Animal Protective Services and you can call the police and say, there's a weird smell coming from Mrs. Jones's house. Right. There's a lot of cats. I'm really concerned. They will come over. But again, it's very difficult. You see a lot of relapse with this because, again, oftentimes people just go, well, I'll take away the hoarding. But then you need group support. You need activities. You need to keep busy. You also need medication. You need considerable follow-up. Yeah. I don't know that people have access to that. So you see this a lot in socioeconomic systems where it's very low income.
But even with my mother-in-law, who has literally the best insurance on the planet, when I asked her neurologist how long would it take for her to be able to see a psychologist or a psychiatrist through the network that she's associated with, it was a 6-month wait.
That's ridiculous.
And so thanks to you, I was able to find a licensed clinical social worker who specialized in working with the elderly, who was a godsend.
Oh, yeah, that's
but we could afford it. She was $200 a pop.
Yeah.
And God bless her, she would come to where my mother-in-law was, first at her home. And then when she went to the assisted living facility to help her transition, she would come. But most folks cannot afford $200 every week, every 2 weeks, even every year. And that's a lot of money.
That psych appointment without insurance was probably $600 or $700 an hour.
Well, that was without insurance. That was like private pay.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So $200. So, I mean, it's insane. So what hope do low income folks have for any treatment. None whatsoever.
Yeah.
Really.
Yeah.
It's a lot. It really is. And, I think you were going to talk about shame and lack of control. It's an interesting thing. My husband, God bless him, I think that he, we as human beings, we normalize that which is not normal, for lack of a better word, because it's a survival skill, and he would say, oh, it wasn't this bad growing up. It got worse as she got older, which of course is true. And at the same time, it was still bad. And I realized a few years ago, we went and had Thanksgiving at his friend's house, whom he went to high school with, still very close to this person. And this friend and I had a moment alone, and he was asking me, oh, how's your husband's mom? And I remember when I would go to the house in high school, and it was just so cluttered. There was stuff everywhere. But you talked to my husband, and he was like, oh, it was fine when I was growing up. But in reality, it wasn't.
Well, and that's the thing. You don't trust your reality.
Right.
Because on one hand, I remember being like, this is weird.
Yeah.
And my family would kind of mock, like, we'd make fun of ourselves. Like, ooh, look at our basement. It's such a mess. And like things like that. But then it was kind of like, but it is, guys. Like, we're going to do something about this, right? And we all knew that was dad's stuff, and you could not do that.
Yeah.
And it, like I said, our space was always kind of protected, but, and I've always thought of myself as pretty much a minimalist, but I have some weird things too that I do where I'm like, especially around food, where I'm like, well, no, I may need that later. I've already purchased this.
Your ass will be like, I'm gonna eat it. I can't let it go to waste. I'm like, bitch, that shit's 5 days old. You're like, I don't care.
Refrigerated.
And you're like, I got the shits. And I'm like, well, surprise, dumbass.
You
of
wanted
course
me to
you got
throw
the
away tea. Listeners, I stand by this.
Old.
I'm not. I am okay. My name is Carolyn, and I am a tea hoarder.
You really are.
When my boyfriend and I moved in together, he was like, "You have a lot of tea." Like
her boyfriend's like me. He wants to purge everything.
He's like, "You have like 30 boxes of tea, and some of it's expired." And I was like, "Tea doesn't expire. It's tea. It's dry.
A date on it for a reason."
Oh,
That's
I don't believe that. Tea people have my back. I like having variety. I like my tension tamer and my morning glory.
Jesus Christ. And Carolyn never finishes a beverage either. This bitch, she'll open like 20 bubbly waters, and my husband, who doesn't waste anything, is like, what the fuck is going on? Who opened all these waters and didn't drink them? Carolyn's the culprit.
It's me.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it's very hard to reconcile what you were told was normal.
Yes.
And then to kind of have a reality of like it took me a while to even have that memory of cleaning friends' houses. And then I had a memory of a mom saying to me, hey, when you come over, you don't have to clean.
Yeah.
We actually can't find things because you put everything away where it's gone. And I felt so embarrassed. Aww. But I go to people's house. I'm like, they're so lucky. They have these big, beautiful places. Why would they want it messy? Let's clean it up.
Yeah.
Which is like kind of psycho.
No, I mean, it's a reaction to what you grew up with. You're like, I desperately want to clean. I'm prevented from doing that at home because my dad will, go ballistic on me. And so I'm going to go to my friends' houses and clean. And their parents are going to think there's something really fucking wrong with me.
You're like, wait, invite Carolyn over after a party.
Totally. I love it.
Sorry, I should not joke. I have to joke. I'm too uncomfortable right now.
Well, you have to have some levity. And I think that Carolyn and I are both, we're very adept at processing our trauma through laughter. Mm-hmm. And that's okay. Mm-hmm. However you choose to process your trauma, as long as you're not hurting yourself or anybody else, that's up to you. Mm-hmm. Nobody could ever come to me and say, hey, the way you laughed at that was inappropriate. If it's something that I've experienced that I'm talking about, I'm like, fuck you. Mm-hmm. You don't get to tell me how I process the things that I went through.
Yes.
And so that's where we're at.
Yeah.
But, final thought on all of this dark and depressing episode is, basically talking about mental health. It's not easy. Mm-hmm. And a lot of families just don't know how to have these conversations. Mm-hmm. I experienced it in my husband's family. Mm-hmm. And hoarding is one of those things that often evokes shame, as we mentioned.
Well, and even us doing this episode.
Yeah.
I called my mom and was like, hey, I'm doing this.
Yeah. And I told my husband, I said, you get to listen to this and tell me whether or not this is something
Same.
that's fit to print.
I feel a little anxiety about like, oh, I hope people that know my dad, like, I hope they don't think different. This shame is there. We're like, oh no, people are going to think something now.
Right. But, we are always encouraging folks to look at anybody who has any sort of mental health disorder or diagnoses through an empathetic lens.
And humanize it. Not normalize it, because there's no normal.
Right. That's right. But we're really, that's our goal here. And it's, it's hard to reach out for help when you're embarrassed. And even if you do seek help for yourself or a family member, help usually comes in the form of very expensive junk removal services, which we paid for, which for starters, as we mentioned, does absolutely nothing to address the why. Why does someone hoard? Removing junk does nothing to treat that. So, please check out the resources in our show notes. Hoarding, as we mentioned, can be dangerous. And the people who hoard are usually hurting. My husband and I firmly believe that had we not got my mother-in-law out of her house, something really terrible would have happened.
You added years to her life.
Something would have happened.
Yeah.
She's so much happier, healthier. She doesn't have, the ability to hoard anymore, but the mentality's still there.
Yes.
We find notes that say, purchase 17 copies of this film to give to people. It's there, but she can't do it anymore. We've removed the ability for her to do that. And
but you didn't remove her dignity.
No, we wanted to keep that intact. It was so important. And she lived clearly for years without dignity and without being seen as I don't want to say not being seen as a human, but just being seen as, she's quirky. She's this. She's that. And now I feel like she's finally living her best life. Her best life in a clean little apartment that's been beautifully decorated. And I'm just so happy for her because it's never too late to start over. But you have to intervene.
Yeah.
You have to help. And if you can help, please do it. It literally may mean the difference between life and death. Yeah. So that's it. Now that we fully bummed you the fuck out, we hope you keep listening. And we hope you give us 5 stars, even if this episode made you really sad.
Made you feel your feelings.
Feel your feelings. That's what we're all about here. All right, everybody. We'll see you next week.
Bye.
Bye.